Hi, this is the fifth video in this series on disorders of childhood and adolescence. And in this video, we're talking about ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. So probably most of you know somebody who's been diagnosed with ADHD. Most people nowadays do know somebody. And sometimes it's an adult, it's not only children, but the onset is typically in childhood, and it's typically more severe in childhood and often recedes when the person gets to adulthood. Certainly the hyperactivity part of the disorder often recedes. So this first page, we're only looking at one part of the disorder here. There's still another page. These are the symptoms of inattention. On the next page, we're going to see symptoms of hyperactivity. So we run into the same problem here as we did with oppositional defiant disorder. And what you're going to see is the word often used at the beginning of almost every of these signs and symptoms of the disorder, which again puts us in that same position as we were in with oppositional defiant disorder. Two problems show up. One is often is not a good quantifier. We don't have a frequency for behaviors, which makes it very difficult to do an assessment. And the other problem that we have with ADHD that we saw with oppositional defiant disorder is developmental appropriateness. So let's look at some of these. I hate reading a PowerPoint to you. You can read. I know that, but let's go over it kind of in shorthand. So it's clearly that the child is not being defiant. So this is not a kid who's in your face and doing it just to annoy you. They're probably trying to behave well, or certainly not trying to misbehave, right? So we need 6 or more of these symptoms. So, and often comes before everything. So paying attention to details, careless mistakes in homework, hard time paying attention in tasks, like lectures, conversations, reading, often doesn't listen to when spoken to directly, their mind wanders, they're elsewhere, they don't follow through on instructions, fail to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace for adults, loses focus, sidetracked, difficulty organizing tasks and activities, hard time with sequential tasks like what comes first and what comes next, keeping materials and belongings in order, messy, disorganized, poor time management skills, avoids or dislikes engaging in anything that requires sustained mental effort. Except, though, this can be different when they're doing something that they really like. So that's important to keep in mind. Losing things, school materials, pencils, books, etc. Distracted by extraneous stimuli. And sometimes that could be their own thoughts. And forgetful. Forgetting to do chores, forgetting to run errands, etc. Now, as you're reading this, or as I'm reading this to you, you're thinking, probably, some of you, oh my gosh, that's me. At least some of the time, right? Or definitely, it's my kid. If you ever, I don't know, a 9-year-old child, their backpack can be a scary place, as some parents know. The crushed and rotting food along with the crushed papers that are sent home and old homework that they don't submit. It's in there. They did it. They just forgot to hand it in. All those things. How do you distinguish between that and a child who is just being a kid, right? That's the hard piece here. And these instructions aren't really detailed enough or aren't quantitative enough, I think, personally, for us to make a clear distinction. Again, I'm not saying that ADHD doesn't exist. I'm saying that it can be difficult to distinguish between ADHD and normal childhood development, particularly because the DSM doesn't help us very much here. So now, Let's look at hyperactivity, okay? Okay. So, hyperactivity and impulsivity. 6 or more of these. We're back to the often. So we have fidgeting and tapping and squirming, leaving seat in situations when you're supposed to keep seated, like getting up during class time. In the office or workplace, they get up and leave their desk. I love this one. Runs about or climbs in situations where it is inappropriate. Okay. Unable to play or engage in play activities or leisure activities quietly. So sometimes you'll see there's some kids are never quiet. They're humming, whistling, singing, talking. Did I say talking? And talking. While they're playing, even when they're playing alone. Often on the go, as if driven by a motor. This is not, by the way, scientific language. I'm not saying it always has to be scientific, but in a disorder that's already a little amorphous, this is not very helpful. I said talking, right? So talking excessively, blurting out an answer before a question has been completed. These are the kids in class who, if they do raise their hand, they're jumping up and down like me, and then they blurt it out anyway. And they interrupt others or intrude upon conversations or interrupt when other people are speaking. Once again, age is very important here because most of these are age appropriate for a 5-year-old. And again, difficult to distinguish between this and normal childhood behavior. Again, I don't like the word normal. Let's say typical childhood behavior. And again, not to say that it doesn't exist. And not to say that children who have ADHD don't run into a lot of trouble and problems. It is difficult to assess. Now, most people in our culture have an opinion about medication and about medicating children. And it comes up in particular when we talk about ADHD. So, I'm going to give you a scenario here. And I'll preface it by saying that ADHD is often comorbid, meaning diagnosed together with oppositional defiant disorder. Even though with ADHD we say the child is not necessarily being defiant. So it doesn't make a lot of sense until you think about it. So let's say you've got a kid who can't sit still, who does blurt out answers, who doesn't let the other kids focus because they're always talking and asking questions, who doesn't submit their homework even if they did it because they leave it in their backpack or they lose it, and who has a hard time following the rules and sequencing the things. The teacher says everybody get in line to go to the lunchroom, and there they are running off. So what do you think happens? This young person winds up maybe punished at the principal's office. And the principal starts getting tired of seeing this child and sends them, back to class and back and forth. And the parents are called in and the parents are upset because they have to be at work and they can't keep taking time off work. So they get annoyed with the child too, right? Eventually, let's say this is an 8-year-old boy or a 9-year-old boy. Eventually, this boy is going to tell you, maybe, that he's bad. And if you say, why are you bad? Well, because I'm always in trouble. And people tell me I'm bad, and I'm bad. I can't be good. I'm not able to be good, so I must be bad. I'm sure that makes you feel as sad as it does me. And eventually, somebody decides to send the child for an assessment. And the psychologist does an assessment, and maybe the child is, borderline ADHD. Maybe meets most of the criteria, not all of the criteria. But when doing the assessment, the child tells me that they're bad. And this child also doesn't have friends. The other kids don't want this child in their work groups when they're doing, schoolwork because the kid's disruptive and and, nobody can get anything done. And they don't contribute because they're not organized enough. And the teacher doesn't really like them because the teacher has to spend more time with this kid than with their other 20, 25 kids. This kid starts feeling lonely and bad. And what we see here is the beginnings of the development of poor self-esteem, right? Now, this kid is sent out of class frequently, suspended or, suspended or sent out of class because of their behavior, right? Well, they might wind up with the other kids who get suspended or thrown out of class, who are thrown out because of their oppositional defiant disorder, because they're getting into trouble for other reasons. They're getting into trouble because they are rebellious, they are defiant. They're purposely breaking rules. These are the kids, I don't know, in my mind they're over in a corner smoking some weed or something, right? Drinking alcohol, getting into trouble. And now this kid finds themselves in that group. And all of a sudden, they have a group, right? And they belong with these other kids. I'm not saying these other kids are bad. Just that this is why we often see comorbidity between ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder. So, back to the psychologist doing the assessment. Let's say you've tried some behavioral treatment, it's not going well because the parents don't have time, because they're both working full time, let's say, or because it just didn't work on the child and the school is unable to be consistent with home. So you put the child on some medication. And what do you know? Now they're able to be quiet in class, they're able to participate, they're able to do their homework, focus, hand in their homework. And something else interesting happens is they find out that school can be interesting too. And now the feedback from the teacher is positive. Other kids might want to have them in their group. Now suddenly they're having maybe a sleepover, right? Now I'm making this very clear cut, right? And I am not pro or against medication. I am simply trying to give a picture of how difficult it can be sometimes to decide what the problem is, how to come up with treatment, what treatment is appropriate, and what are the results that we're looking for. If the child's self-esteem is plummeting and they're winding up now actually having oppositional behaviors and troublesome behaviors, what have we done by denying treatment, right? By punishing this kid who can't behave in the way that we want them to behave. And by the way, this also comes back to the environment being suited to the child's personality. Sometimes kids are just very spirited and unsuited for their school environment. And again, they wind up in trouble. And when kids get in trouble, that's when they start behaving badly, get into drugs and alcohol, sex, poor self-esteem, truancy, and other kinds of problems. So I'm going to end this video on ADHD now.